hopes of becoming the youngest person to fly across country and back died with her this morning.
When Jessica Dubroff was just 7 years old, she took on the challenge of a lifetime, hoping to break the world record as the youngest person to pilot a transcontinental flight. She set off across the United States with her father and flight instructor. But the pressure from the media to reach their destination, treacherous weather, and poor decision-making soon put their record-breaking attempt into question. Jessica Dubroff was born on May 5, 1988, in Falmouth, Massachusetts. She was one of 3 children, having a brother, 10-year-old Joshua, and a sister, 4-year-old Jasmine. Growing up in California's Pescadero, Jessica never enrolled in school or watched TV, but she did partake in a thrilling hobby, flying. For her 6th birthday, her father bought her flying lessons. When Jessica's father's Lloyd was younger, his dream was to fly in the Air Force, but he was unable to pursue this dream. The instructor who was willing to give flying lessons to a 6-year-old was Vietnam veteran Joe Reed. The lessons seemed to be going well, but Lloyd had bigger ambitions for his daughter. With just 33 hours of flying experience under Jessica's belt, Lloyd hatched a plan, one which could have ended in glory. He floated the idea by Jessica's mom Lisa, and the 2 of them approached Joe Reed. The 3 of them agreed that Jessica could be up to the challenge. She had an enthusiasm about her that never waned. But would this be enough? Joe had his reservations. He wondered, like many trained pilots, whether a young child had the attention span and physical strength to make the journey. But he also saw it as an opportunity to make money. He was being paid to fly with a little girl and her father across the country. What could possibly go wrong? The adults began making preparations for the world record attempt. The journey was mapped out and would take about 8 days in total, starting in Half Moon Bay on the California coast, with a few refueling and overnight stops in Massachusetts and back again. The total distance would be 6,660 miles. Jessica's parents dubbed it the Sea to Shining Sea and began publicizing the adventure. With the media behind them, preparations for the event soon built traction. Jessica's parents produced caps and t-shirts with the Sea to Shining Sea slogan printed across them. These were to be taken with them and handed out to fans and well-wishers at various stops along the route. If Jessica succeeded, then she would be the youngest person to pilot a transcontinental flight. At just 4'2" and aged 7, Jessica's attempt made the headlines across the continent. She became an overnight celebrity, and it seemed as though the whole country was urging her on. Few, if any, stopped to question whether this was a safe thing for a child to do. One of the few who did was the Guinness Book of World Records, which rejected Lloyd's facts to formally recognize the record attempt. They had stopped certifying the youngest pilot record a few years earlier, as they could see that a potential disaster was on the horizon. Instead, they offered Jessica a mention in their museum if she was successful. Despite becoming known as the world's youngest pilot, Jessica was far from officially holding that title. Legally, individuals cannot become licensed pilots until they turn 17, or 16 for a student pilot certificate. They must also have logged significantly more flight hours than Jessica had. She hadn't received a pilot certificate or even a medical certificate. However, she was still allowed to operate the aircraft under the supervision of a licensed pilot. The airplane they chose to make the incredible journey was a Cessna 177B Cardinal single-engine aircraft. Despite being small, it was still too big for Jessica to reach the controls. They fitted a booster seat to the cockpit so that Jessica could see out of the windows and added extensions to the pedals so that her feet could reach them. These customizations would allow Jessica full control of the aircraft at all times. But she wasn't going it alone. Her father planned to join her as a passenger, and her instructor Joe would be next to her all the way. Lloyd knew how to work the media, and the 57-year-old managed to get a significant amount of attention. But he was no pilot. With no experience behind the controls of an aircraft, Lloyd came up with the flight plan. He scribbled the route down by hand on a piece of paper, taking in specific refueling and overnight stops where maximum media coverage could be. A news station gave him a video camera and blank tape cassettes to document his daughter's adventure. There was no immediate financial incentive for this at the time, but they considered making a film about it afterwards. When asked in an interview why she wanted to take on this dangerous mission, Jessica replied, "Well, I believe it was my dad's idea." At 7 a.m. on April 10, 1996, following an early morning live television interview, Jessica took off from Half Moon Bay with her father and Joe Reed alongside her. At that time, 57-year-old Joe had logged 1,484 hours of flying time, but most of his flying had been along the California coastline. He was instructed to only take the controls of the aircraft in an emergency. The rest was up to Jessica. The cameras rolled as the little plane took off into the sky. They flew eastwards, landing at Elko, Nevada to refuel before continuing on their way. Everything was going to plan. They made another brief stop in Rock Springs, Wyoming. But by this time, Jessica was feeling the effects of concentrating for so long. The airport manager noted how tired the little girl looked before they took off once more, heading to the final destination of their first leg, Cheyenne in Wyoming. When they arrived at the end of leg 1 in Cheyenne, the welcome they received was a huge boost. They had landed at 5:56 p.m., but before they could rest, they were interviewed by the media. It was clear from the interviews they gave that all three of them were tired, not least of all 7-year-old Jessica. "I can't wait to sleep," she told the cameras. Even experienced pilot Joe phoned his wife and told her how tired he was. It was going to be a long journey. Perhaps the most enthusiastic of all of them was Jessica's father, Lloyd. "This started off as a father-daughter adventure," he said, "and it's gotten wonderfully out of hand." As daylight broke on April 11th, the trio of adventurers made their way down to the runway. But they were in for a shock. The weather was terrible, and it was deteriorating further. A heavy thunderstorm was heading directly for the airport at Cheyenne. Heavy rain and sleet pounded down the runway. The NTSB report highlighted that the pre-flight weather briefing had warned of severe weather conditions, including thunderstorms and strong winds, which posed a significant risk for a small aircraft like the Cessna 177B Cardinal. A radio director who had interviewed the team offered them to stay in the city until the weather cleared, but Lloyd declined. They had local media interviews already lined up, and he was determined to stick to the schedule. The report also criticized the decision-making process of both the instructor and Jessica's father, emphasizing that they underestimated the severity of the weather conditions and overestimated Jessica's ability to handle such challenges. That morning, Jessica made a last call to her mother and asked her if she could hear the rain on the other end of the phone. She had never flown in those conditions before. Against his better judgment, egged on by the crowd holding placards which read, "Good luck, Jessica," and the media storm of the event, Joe requested special permission from the tower to take off in such bad weather. He was granted special clearance, and the original schedule was still going ahead. Just before taking off for their second leg, Jessica gave some more interviews to eager reporters, but she looked cold, tired, and distracted. She admitted to being tired, and when she was asked if she was scared, she just looked away. But the trio climbed into the aircraft and taxied along the runway. Joe had already performed the pre-flight inspection, and she was ready to go. But it was clear that the adventurous trio were tired and rushed. They forgot to pull the wheel chocks before firing up the engine. Joe made a few slip-ups over the radio, requesting a special IFR rather than a special VFR. Although only minor, these mistakes can cost big in the world of aviation. The NTSB report underscored that while Jessica was allowed to operate the aircraft under supervision, she was not legally recognized as a pilot. The regulations required a qualified pilot to be in command, and the responsibility rested on Joe Reed, who failed to exercise appropriate control. The plane battled with the gusting winds as they taxied down the runway. Lightning was beginning to strike in the darkening skies. The storm was upon them. As they gained speed, Jessica pulled back on the yoke, and the nose of the plane tilted upwards. It left runway 30 at 8:24 a.m. on April 11, 1996. But eyewitnesses could see the plane struggling. It wasn't gaining the height it needed. One person driving their vehicle near the airport was shocked to see a plane taking off in those conditions. They had their own Vipers on full, and still couldn't see well through their windshield. The wings of the Cessna were shaking as it powered towards the heavy clouds. At less than 400 feet, the plane turned towards the right and then stalled. There was a crash of thunder, and the plane then nosedived at a near vertical angle. Joe took the controls, battling to right the plane. In a matter of a few terrifying seconds, horrified onlookers watched as the 7-year-old's plane crashed into a street below. People rushed to the scene, Carnegie Court less than 1 mile from the airport. The plane had luckily avoided any houses or anyone on the ground, but the wreckage made for harrowing viewing. There was simply no way anyone could survive that kind of impact. The cockpit and 2 front seats had been completely crushed and displaced backwards. Fuel poured out over the wings, but there was no fire. The seats were bent and contorted from the impact, stained with blood. The red duffel bag containing the merchandise for fans and medias along the route was torn open. Hats and t-shirts bearing the words, "Jessica Whitney Dubroff, Sea to Shining Sea, April 1996, spilling out and littering the street. It was a devastating sight that haunted those who witnessed it. Another critical detail from the NTSB report was the improper weight and balance calculations. The aircraft was not only overweight, but the distribution of the weight also made the aircraft more difficult to control, especially in turbulent conditions. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation revealed that the plane was overweight by 96 pounds at takeoff, which would have increased the stall speed by approximately 2%. At the time of the crash, the plane was still 84 pounds over the maximum gross takeoff weight. The aircraft stalled when it failed to maintain sufficient airspeed after entering dense cloud cover. The NTSB also attributed the accident to Joe Reed's poor aeronautical decision-making, which was influenced by the overly ambitious travel schedule and media commitments. On the final report, Jessica was listed as a passenger along with her father. She was not a qualified pilot, and the pressure from her parents to complete such a dangerous task was considered cruel. All 3 individuals on board were reported to have succumbed to traumatic injuries. On April 15, 1996, Jessica was buried at Mount Hope Cemetery in Pescadero, where she used to ride her bike. Her coffin was carried in a pickup truck, adorned with white flowers. On top of her coffin was a toy airplane. Following the tragedy, President Bill Clinton signed the Federal Aviation Reauthorization Act of 1996, prohibiting anyone under the age of 16 from operating an aircraft. The tragic incident led to a significant change in aviation policy, highlighting the need for stricter regulations to prevent similar occurrences. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, revisited its guidelines on underage flying and the involvement of minors in high-risk aviation activities. Although it seemed like everyone was behind Jessica at the time, child therapists spoke out about the terrible decisions made by the adults that led up to the disaster. They said, yes, she had an interest in flying, but a child who enjoys playing with toy soldiers shouldn't be sent to war. Although her life ended far too soon, she will always be remembered by those who knew her. Her influence and the beautiful moments will never be forgotten. She left a lasting impression that we will cherish